Hello everyone, welcome back to Free Philosophy, the video series put on at Liberty for the People. Today I'm going to take a break from the sort of basic building block ideas that we've been talking about, and I'm going to jump straight in to responding to a particular issue that's come up in the last couple of days. I want to do both kinds of things with these videos, so it's good to take a break from one and try to do some of them. Adam Kokesh, who I greatly admire for a lot of the great work he's done in organizing veterans to be, against the war, in his advocacy and support for Ron Paul, in his radio and television and online presence and programming. I'm picking on him a little bit today, even though I do admire him, as I just said, because he recently released a video while he was attending a Reason rally in Washington, D.C., and I think it's a classic example, with all due respect to Adam, I think it's a classic example of the kind of muddled thinking that will sometimes drag us down as libertarians if we're not careful. And the video is on YouTube, and it's got the title, Taking Libertarian Logic to the Spiritual Extreme. And there Adam argues that the proper libertarian position regarding religious matters, that is if we're going to be logical and rational. He graciously grants that we don't necessarily have to be logical and rational, but if we want to be logical and rational, as libertarians, we have to extend this to spiritual matters and be atheistic or agnostic. And in particular, in his very powerful and persuasive style, Adam says it like this. He says, as libertarians, as objectivists, as voluntarists, as anarcho-capitalists, as people that want to create a better world for our children, and we claim to be doing it by applying logic and reason to politics, we have to do the same thing to spirituality, because it is the mythologies of spirituality that lay the foundation for the mythologies of politics. It is the lies of religion that allow the lies of government to continue. All of these paradigms, the current paradigms of religion and government, are based on ignoring curiosity and filling it instead with wishful thinking, with ignorance, and so forth and so on. So the first, okay, that's a basic claim, not something that's new to many of us, I'm sure. What should we say to this? Well, first off, let's just understand that this connection between libertarianism, which is a political theory, and atheism, which is a position about metaphysics or a philosophy of religion or ontology and to some extent epistemology, the connection between these two subjects is not at all obvious. It's not just obvious. It's not clear on the surface of things why holding a certain view of politics and the state should force you to hold some particular view about the existence of God or of the validity or veracity or trustworthiness of a particular revealed religion, like, say, Christianity or Islam or Judaism or what have you. You've got to do something more to make the connection between the two things explicit. And what many people do, and what Adam does in the video, is they assert a sort of, for lack of a better term, a sociological theory of the connection. A sociological theory that connects religion and government, that makes religion and government out to be the two sides of the same coin, or, to make them out to be two different exemplars of the same kind, of the same type. And that is the way that Adam proceeds in his video. So you have to somehow say that government and religion are alike, maybe that they come from the same nefarious source, they both represent the same kind of human frailty or folly, so that the idea then would be that, look, libertarians are already right to reject government, but government and religion are the same kind of thing somehow, so libertarians should reject religion as well. Okay? But the question, of course, is, are government and religion the same kind of thing? In the philosophically relevant and significant sense that would, mean that if you reject one, you have to reject the other on pain of being, logically inconsistent if you refuse to do so. Well, that's really, really not clear at all, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So first, let's take a quick detour and talk about objectivism, because Adam mentioned it when he was listing off his labels for libertarianism. So I'm not sure if Adam actually is an objectivist or if he was just mentioning it because it was one of the things that some libertarians use to describe themselves. But let's talk about it because he mentioned it. It needs to be noted that objectivism is not the same thing as libertarianism. It is a subset. It is one particular philosophy whose adherents happen to be libertarians, but by no means are objectivism and libertarianism the same thing. And it's only, objectivism is just one kind of libertarian worldview that's out there. It's widely known already that objectivists follow their founder, Ayn Rand, and hold that atheism is required of all rational people. So as soon as somebody says I'm an objectivist, unless they're actually departing from Rand herself, you know that they are an atheist. That's just part and parcel of objectivism. Okay. Now, so in that sense, anytime an objectivist wants to see the connection and say, look, all libertarians are atheists, I mean, we have to be a little skeptical and say, well, no, not really. Objectivists are always atheists, but there's a whole lot of other libertarians out there that aren't objectivists. So unless you've got to give us some extra reason that's not based in objectivism per se, and I'm not getting into the details of objectivism right now, I understand, but you've got to give us some reason other than some objectivist argument per se to be an atheist. Otherwise, there's no connection at all. I mean, there's no obvious connection. Because, again, the vast majority of libertarians are not objectivists, as influential as it may have been and may still be. It is by no means the only way to go. Okay, so and that's not getting into the being charitable here. We're not going to go right now into some of the arguments, such as Ayn Rand's argument for atheism, which is frankly a little bit nutty. Okay, she argued that the law of identity proves that God doesn't exist. That's bizarre, to say the least. But even if objectivists use standard philosophical arguments against God's existence, there's still no clear reason why that should be connected to libertarianism. I mean, objectivists happen to connect them, but that doesn't mean that all libertarians have to connect them. So again, there's something missing here. Okay, so let's go back to this basic question then of what the connection might be. And I'm calling it sociological in nature. This idea that religion and the state are the same kind of thing, or they're somehow in cahoots with each other. I'm not using this as a smear, but clearly we can call this a sort of Marxist theory of the similarity between religion and the state. Marx with his famous dictum that the state historically uses religion as the opiate of the masses to keep the great numbers of poor masses of humanity in line with the state's agenda. So that the rulers of the state and the leaders of the church end up working kind of in cahoots to advance the same socioeconomic political agenda. That's, so again, we're not using that as a smear word. I mean, that just is, a basically broadly Marxist account of how the state and religion are the same. So it's not a problem for a libertarian such as objectivists or like Adam, for instance, to embrace that if they want to. But it's a controversial claim, okay? And the vast majority of libertarians probably aren't going to be convinced by it. I'm certainly not convinced by it. I don't think that religion and the state are always in cahoots. In fact, the history on this topic is very mixed. If you look at the history of freedom movements for political freedom, movements that resist the ever-encroaching power of the state, where do a great number of those movements come from? They come from within religious institutions. They come from people who are also very religious. Many of the greatest philosophical writings on freedom were done by people who were directly affiliated and associated with a religion. Just to give a quick and dirty example, we can think of Augustine's famous work in The City of God, which is by no means a rah-rah human governments are awesome theme. He's trying to point out very clearly the obvious and abject failures of human governments, especially when they are, in his mind, operating apart from a proper knowledge of God and his will for mankind. But in the course of doing that, he lays out all kinds of typical tyrannies and awful policies that human governments tend to perpetrate against their subjects, including his famous apocryphal story of the pirate who comes before the emperor and says, tells the emperor that I rob a few ships, they call me a pirate, you steal from everybody and they call you an emperor, that kind of thing. So that's all. I mean, Augustine got it. Augustine on some fundamental level got that the state is not an inherently righteous institution, that it's capable of great evil. He wasn't just out there telling the masses to shut up and stay in line and do whatever the state said. And this is just, this is more or less an off the top of my head example, believe it or not. We could really multiply these. I would argue the real problem that we have when it comes to the state is a problem of some people just want to dominate others. And the state is the most practical way to do so historically. But in addition to the state, you will occasionally see the suits and the ties and the other people with a libido dominandi coming into other institutions in society. So most bullies try to use the state as the channel for their bullying, but other bullies will use religion, or they will use other social institutions to try to advance their unrighteous causes. It will happen. It's a real thing, but by no means is it inherent to the religious institutions that they advocate for this kind of oppression or violence. In fact, there have been many times in history, again, where the church has been the legitimate force fighting against the state to protect the people. The whole history of church-state relations really is a struggle and a battle between the two. So usually the theologians and the philosophers wished that they were more cooperative than they were, but they really weren't that cooperative. And again, even when philosophers and theologians would talk about them cooperating together and how they wished they would do that, it was so they could do things like protect the needs of the people, not so they could do things like advanced state power per se. In any case, I mean, we can choose not to believe all of that. We can choose to give that a sort of Straussian reading or something and say, well, the esoteric meaning behind what they were really thinking, behind what they said, what they were really thinking is, we just want to make ourselves rich and powerful at the expense of the poor saps beneath us. I mean, you can hold that theory, but again, it's a theory. It's not. It's by no means obvious. It's by no means something that every libertarian needs to accept. This idea that the church and the state are the same kind of institution, and if you don't like the state, you have to also dislike religion. That simply doesn't follow. You're going to have to do a lot more work to establish that kind of a claim. And this brings us to the most important point, saved for last. As is often the case in philosophy of religion, there really is not much of an argument from atheists, libertarians, when they make these kinds of appeals. They don't argue for atheism. They just take it for granted and just assert that atheism is the more rational position. But that's, again, really not necessarily true. And I'm not even talking right now as a theist per se. I'm just saying that if you're familiar with the philosophical literature at all, the case for or against God's existence, or the case for or against the idea of certain religions being it being possible for God to reveal himself in certain religious texts or something like that. These are not settled questions. There are good arguments by reasonable people on both sides of these kinds of questions. So the idea that we just have to accept or assume that all the good arguments are with the atheists, and if you want to be a rational libertarian, you better be an atheist, is just not, it's just nonsense, frankly. It's nonsense. Or if it's not nonsense, somebody's got a lot more work to do to prove their case. And making it out like libertarians are, need to be committed to one side of this debate or the other is just driving an unnecessary wedge between all the other non-libertarians in the world that we're still trying to reach. And that's what makes me most sad about Adam's video, is that his reasoning is very noble. His motivation is noble. He wants us to do a better job of bringing people from outside the libertarian fold into the camp. Right? He wants us to convince a lot of these left-leaning atheists that they should come be libertarians. Well, that's fine, but making it out as though libertarianism is just inherently atheistic is not the way to do that. If you do that, then you're alienating all of the religious believers who lean left. There are a lot of people in society who have politics that are not libertarian who are religious, because again, it does not go without saying that all the rational people in the world are atheistic. So it doesn't make any more sense, and it's not going to help libertarianism anymore in the long run to say that we need to connect libertarianism to atheism directly so we can bring in the people from Reason and Skeptic and Infidels.org. That's not going to be any better of a strategy long term for us than it would be if we tried to connect libertarianism to Lutheranism, to bring in all those left-leaning Lutheran political theorists. The answer is, to argue for liberty on its own terms, on its own merits, and not to falsely connect it to some religious argument, either for God's existence or against. That's just a mistake, and it's just one of those many ways that we, as libertarians, we often overtalk these issues into something that other people don't want to agree with anymore. It's a bad idea, in my opinion. Okay, that's all for this time. Thanks a lot.